For anyone who's kept up with my channel for the last couple of weeks, you might have guessed that I have been in a bit of a Terminator mood lately. For a little less than a month, I've been watching the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and now I am finished. Naturally, I'm a big bag of mixed emotions right now. On the one hand, this series was, for the most part, simply stunning. I've seen few shows that have been quite this good in such a short amount of time. This is not to say that the show didn't have its faults. I think particularly in Season 2, there were a few episodes that were just clunkers, for lack of a better word. But, on the other hand, the show is now over, and it ended with what I would like to call a huge cliffhanger, to put it mildly. In this video, I wanted to talk about the ending to the series specifically. If you are listening to this video and you have not seen the Sarah Connor Chronicles, I urge you to stop listening, at least if you don't like spoilers. I will heavily be spoiling the series, and specifically the series finale. So the series ends with what you could definitely call a wham episode, as I mentioned earlier. For all of this season, we've had plots concerning the Connors, Derek Reese, and Cameron, the Terminator sent from the future by future John Connor to protect 16-year-old John Connor. Also in this season, we've had a subplot that never really concluded. A T-1000 was posing as a deceased human, Catherine Weaver, and was running a corporation called ZeraCorp. During this season, she uploaded an artificial intelligence called the Turk into the body of a Terminator from the future that originally was programmed to kill John Connor. This new entity is called John Henry. For most of the season, I think everyone who is watching this series just assumed, and I can't say I blame them, that Catherine Weaver was attempting to build Skynet, the organization in the future that humanity is fighting and is in charge of the machines. However, we find out in the series finale that Weaver was attempting to build something to combat Skynet. We're not sure to what ends she intended to do this, since the series ends about 2 minutes after she reveals this. Cameron, the good Terminator working with the Connors, is sent to destroy John Henry's body. We're not sure what she is actually planning, but it's clear that she does not intend to destroy John Henry. In fact, she gives him a knife, and we later find out that he took her chip. Later, the Connors and Catherine Weaver find Cameron's lifeless body minus the chip, and Weaver deduces that Cameron actually let John Henry take her chip. Weaver also says that John Henry took Cameron's chip to the future. Now, this is where things get interesting. I guess since a whole lot happened in this episode, it is forgivable for everyone to take what Weaver says at face value. But there are several things that make me doubt that John Henry actually went to the future. First and foremost, when Cameron sees John Henry for the first time, she closes the door behind her and we hear the door click closed. When the Connors and Weaver come to the basement to find Cameron's body, the door is opened. You might argue that this is just a minor mistake that someone made during filming, and that I shouldn't read too much into it. But there's the more pressing evidence, which I'm frustrated neither Sarah nor John seem to notice. One, they know that only organic, living material can go through time. They time traveled in the very first episode, and their clothes did not make it through. So they should be asking the question, how could John Henry take Cameron's chip to the future? It's not covered in skin like a Terminator is. That, coupled with the fact that there was no sign of actual time travel having taken place in the room where Cameron's body was. Every time we've seen someone go through time, it starts with a weird energy bubble, and then the naked traveler appears. The bubble will destroy anything that was where the bubble would be. So pavement, grass, dirt, the floor of a basement, a large dent would be left in the ground from where the energy bubble was. Now, we don't get a very good look at the ground, but the basement wasn't large enough for someone to go time traveling without the bubble also leaving effects on the walls or where the table was or on the ceiling. So it is my theory that John Henry did take Cameron's chip, but he did not go to the future. Although we never saw him disconnect from the internet and the original Turk body in the entire time that he was in the ZeraCorp basement, it seems like he was able to disconnect, as everyone in the basement thought that he had done so and gone to the future. While I don't have any theories about where John Henry went, I'm certain that he is still in the year 2009 when the series ends. But John Connor and Catherine Weaver both go to the future anyway. Catherine Weaver allegedly to find John Henry, and John Connor to find Cameron's chip. This is when things get even more interesting. John, naked, finds a jacket on the ground and puts it on. He runs into some human resistance fighters, and among them is Derek, who we saw die in the previous episode. What is interesting is that Derek and the rest of the resistance fighters don't recognize the name John Connor. And then we find out that the jacket John is wearing belongs to Kyle Reese, who is the father of John from the first Terminator film. Then the episode and the series ends. Now there are two ways to interpret the end of this episode, and thus the end of the series. One way to interpret the ending was shared by one of the screenwriters of the series, Josh Friedman. In an interview, the interviewer said that, as per John Connor essentially skipping over 20 years, he is now free of his obligation to eventually found the Resistance and become the leader and eventual savior of humanity. And since he did skip over 20 years, he in fact no longer is the founder as per this new timeline. And even though every piece of the Terminator mythology has led us to believe that John Connor is indispensable to the Resistance, this seems to indicate that what will be, as I've said about the machines in the Terminator world in a previous video. This seems only right. If you destroy Cyberdyne, which you think will become the future of the machines, then the machines still keep coming. Then it makes sense that if you remove John Connor from the timeline, that the humans don't simply stop resisting, they just find a different leader. And while I do like certain things about this interpretation, I don't actually subscribe to it. The second way that one can look at this episode is in this way. Almost every flashback/flash forward to the future that we see happens in the year 2027. There are at least a couple of flashbacks that aren't dated, so it's possible that those flashbacks happen earlier than 2027. My theory is that John and Weaver have actually jumped to the year earlier than 2027. Maybe 2024 or something like that, give or take 1 year or two. And now that John is in the future, he will become the leader of the Resistance. And so by the year 2027, everything that we saw happen in the flashbacks/flash forwards will happen. What will be, in other words. So the Derek that we see in the end of the episode, he doesn't recognize John Connor yet. But in, let's say, 3 years, he will definitely know John Connor. Now, there is a problem with this. The most important is the logistics of it. How would John go from being a nobody, younger than most everyone in the Resistance, to being in charge of it all? You could say that he jumped to an earlier time period, let's say 2020. But Derek doesn't look 7 years younger than he did in the flashback/flash forwards. There's another piece to the puzzle. While it isn't conclusive, I do like. In the Season 1 episode Dungeons and Dragons, Derek is having a flashback to when he first met John Connor in the future. This flashback ends with teenage John coming up behind Derek and the flashback fading back into reality, with John talking to a wounded Derek. The very reasonable way to look at this is that the John in the flashback is not really in the flashback and is the real John from reality imposing in on the flashback, waking Derek up. But what if that was the John Connor? Because John, at the end of the episode Born to Run, comes to that future and becomes the leader of the Resistance. Likewise, one of the first times Derek sees John, he instantly knows him as John Connor, and he's asking where he sent Kyle Reese. Now, Derek already identified Sarah Connor and recognized her by her picture that Kyle Reese carried in the future. So you could say that when Derek saw this kid with Sarah, he made a logical deduction that it was her son. And he did see him with Sarah before he was wounded. But then he was wounded, and he was yelling all kinds of things. Chief among them, he was asking where John had sent his brother. If he knew this guy was John Connor, and the John Connor that Derek knew was actually the middle-aged leader of the Resistance, then why would he ask about Kyle to the teenage John Connor? Both of these instances are very sketchy at best, but I do think they somewhat support this idea. Now there are some other problems. Derek specifically mentions that he and John celebrated John's 30th birthday in the Season 1 finale. If teenage John from the year 2009 is actually the leader of the Resistance, then this is either a mistake or Derek lied. We did see him lie about other things, like murdering Andy Good and not telling the Connors about Jesse. It's entirely possible that Derek knows that teenage John Connor will be going to the future very soon. He doesn't know when, but he knows that it won't be long because the John he knew looked exactly the same. If this second theory is actually fact, then it makes me suspect that Catherine Weaver deliberately misled John about John Henry going to the future. When they first arrive in the future, John asks where Cameron's body is. Weaver calmly says that it doesn't go through. She knows the rules of time travel. I can't even begin to formulate a reason for her actions, but it's entirely possible that Weaver told John that Cameron's chip was in the future so that he could become the leader of the Resistance. Maybe she felt that him staying in the year 2009 was too risky. I rather like this theory, although it leaves more questions regarding Weaver's motivations. But no matter what theory we choose to believe as fact, there will still be dangling questions left over. Now, any speculation about this series is basically moot at this point. The show ended 4 years ago, and the longer it is that the show ended, the less likely it seems to me that the show will ever have a revival of any kind. Now, if the show had been renewed for a third season, for one thing, most of this speculation would be completely irrelevant, since they would be addressing these cliffhangers in the third season. And if the show had been renewed, then I feel like this second theory about John becoming the leader of the Resistance as a teenager would have been completely disproven. But since the show isn't going to be renewed, and it seems unlikely we'll ever get a novel or a tie-in comic book sequel or anything like that, I definitely prefer to look at this second theory as canon. It gives the series more closure this way, and makes the ending seem more like an ending instead of something that would be followed by a to be continued. This video doesn't really serve much purpose other than allowing me to vent my frustrations. I know I was one of the people who rolled my eyes back when people were mad that this series ended, and now that I've seen the show, I am one of the complainers wishing the show had some way to continue. I know it won't, which is why I'm doing this video. I do think this video offers a great way to facilitate discussion. If you were a fan of this series, I'd love to see your thoughts on these theories. And if you have any other theories, I'd love to see a video response. I hope this video found you well, and if it did, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks.